Hello and welcome to this lecture for Introduction to Philosophy. And in this first lecture, I'm just going to take you through some of the background to Plato's Republic. And I think it's really helpful to have some of these details and this background in mind when we're thinking about the text. And as we'll see, when Plato writes the Republic, he has a lot of this history present in his mind, and he's thinking through a lot of these issues, a lot of this history of democracy, and what happened with the Athenian democracy in his lifetime. He's thinking through a lot of these issues and sort of giving a sort of a philosophical framework for thinking through the problems with democracy in this text. So it's really important to understand some of these historical details and the kind of the hidden conflicts in Greek society that Plato was calling attention to when he writes the Republic. So we're going to see these themes emerging as we sort of dig deeper and dig into the book. And another thing here, I think the history is really central to understanding the book, but the importance of the book is that it helps us think through the idea of democracy, what it means, its problems, and it helps us to do that from a philosophical point of view. So the value of the book is entirely current in my view, in the sense that it's helping us to think through the problems that any democracy faces, the deeper problems that it has to solve and deal with. And those are the things Plato's addressing in the Republic. And as we'll see, again, there's considerable parallel between the problems that plagued Athens in the 6th century and some of the problems of democracy today. Those conflicts, we can find similarities and parallels there to help us sort of understand and make sense of these things as kind of world historical conflicts that are continually brought to the surface. And so we'll see how that works. All right, now once we dig into the book, we'll see we have to understand this this relationship between these two fundamental towering figures of Western philosophy, Plato on the left and Socrates on the right. And the relationship between these two is very simple, in the sense that Socrates, who was older, was Plato's teacher. And so it's Socrates who sort of teaches Plato the art of philosophy, but Socrates himself is not a writer. He's not an aristocrat like Plato. In other words, he's not a sort of necessarily as wealthy, as well born as Plato was in Athenian society. So Socrates' his primary affect seems to be as a teacher, that he teaches, he discusses, he likes raising questions about concepts like virtue, truth, and goodness. And in contrast with Plato, we find a student who sort of writes down and systematizes, or sort of turns into a system, the works created by his teacher Socrates. And of course, he's also reflecting on that teaching and providing his own distinct input and ideas with regard to what's happening as well. So we'll see the Republic is written by Plato, but Socrates is the main character in the book. In fact, nearly all of Plato's works involve Socrates as a central character, and in the Republic, it's Socrates who drives the dialogue forward, and it's Socrates' ideas that power the dialogue. Obviously, one thing we'll have to think about when we look closely is whether we can kind of separate them, whether we can find a difference between Socrates and Plato. Maybe Plato is criticizing or amending Socrates at certain points, so we'll have to look carefully at that. But the first thing to see is that they were both citizens during the classical age of Athens. Socrates earlier born 470 and Plato born towards the kind of almost the sort of sunset of the Greek classical age in 428. And Plato writes the Republic in about 385. So after Socrates' death, as we'll see. All right, so it's really important for us to get a sense of of Athenian democracy. Athens was a city-state on the Greek island, on the sort of Greek mainland, and so Athens is one of many city-states at this time that are independent political entities. And at this time in history, a city-state is a city is sort of the biggest political unit that you can successfully feed and that you can successfully defend. So units at this time didn't get much bigger than cities, and it's in Athens that we see the birth of a democracy which is in years to come will be lauded as a sort of crowning achievement of Western civilization. And that democracy really starts up at the end of the Greco-Persian Wars, which began in 499 BCE, right, and involves several Greek city-states, including Athens. And eventually the Persians were decisively defeated at the battles of Marathon in 490 BCE and Salamis in 480 BCE, and these were both decisive naval battles. And it was in this period that the Greek navy became very strong and became its sort of primary military force. And it was the Greek navy, powered by its ordinary citizens, and of course the ships of these times, the triremes, needed a lot of labor to be able to move. They were powered by hand and oars, and so a lot of man labor was needed to make them work. And so the male citizens sort of powered the triremes and helped the Athenians, win these decisive battles against the Persian with the help of other Greek city-states. And it was the power of the Greek navy at Salamis. If we see in the map below, the Persian fleet were captured in this sort of narrow strait and decisively defeated by the Allied fleet. So it's the end of the Persian Wars that we see the birth of the sort of classical Athenian democracy. Now, one figure after the Persian Wars who emerges as a kind of great leader of ordinary Greek citizens is this figure Pericles. And many of those poorer citizens who had manned the ships to defeat the Persians were now demanding more power to run in running the city's affairs. So they wanted more of a say. They wanted more. They wanted a sort of greater say in debates about how the city's wealth would be distributed, about how the city's affairs would be run. And Pericles really championed their cause and brought those citizens more broadly into Athenian democracy. Prior to this point, a sort of framework democracy had been installed shortly before the Persian War, but it was still based on property qualifications, and these were sort of reduced and removed as Greek citizens came to enjoy a kind of political equality that was reflected in their political institutions, as we'll see in a minute. And that equality is the basis of the sort of fundamental structure of Greek democracy. So Pericles presided over what's known as the sort of classical age, or sometimes the golden age of Athens, and this involved the promotion of art and literature. It involved a massive public building project. Most of the surviving structures of the ancient city that you can see today, if you go to sort of modern Athens, including the Parthenon, the ancient temple of Athena pictured here, most of these structures were built during the time of Pericles in this public building phase. And so that phase again used a lot of labor, and so it sort of built upon the sort of power of the population of Athens and invested in public works that could be enjoyed by that population, that they could be sort of proud of their own cultural heritage. So this reflected the new kind of public power of the ordinary Greeks, the ordinary Athenian citizens. And during this time, Athens became a wealthy city-state. Art, tragedy, and philosophy were to thrive in this new golden age. This is when the sort of classic festivals with tragedy and comedy were sort of hosted in the ancient theatre, and the great tragedians Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides were sort of all practicing during this time, and so this was sort of a sort of cultural golden age for the Athenians. And during this time as well, its navy became increasingly powerful, and Athens began to develop traits of an empire. It entered into a sort of league with other city-states, of which it was the kind of lead. It was the kind of leader, and it was able to pressure smaller city-states to do its bidding. Sorry, so it sort of became culturally powerful, economically powerful, and became a kind of regional power on the Greek mainland. And that, as we'll see, led it into conflicts that became increasingly difficult to avoid, and eventually sort of led to its downfall. So we see the story here about the city becoming wealthy, including its citizens, and this idea of equality and promoting their culture and increasing public wealth. But eventually that leads to a kind of it leads Athens to sort of overreach and overstep. It becomes sort of too powerful. That becomes a danger to other city-states, and that eventually leads to a major conflict, as we'll see. All right, so let's look at the actual structure of Athenian government and society during the time of Pericles and the classical age. So all citizens were considered equal at this time, but of course there were qualifications on citizenship. To be a citizen, you had to be an Athenian-born male with 2 Athenian-born parents. So in other words, a citizen born to Athenian parents and born in the city of Athens. So anybody that sort of came under that qualification was a citizen. It's estimated there are about 30,000 or so citizens, and it's estimated that the total population of Athens at this time was about roughly 250,000, maybe 300,000 citizens. Right? So the citizens are, and this is the really important point to get here, I think here we'll start to see parallels with problems of democracy in our own day. Citizens were a small minority of the population of Athens, right? 30,000 out of 250 or 300,000 is a small number. Firstly, of course, all women were excluded, including Athenian-born women. Women were not entitled to be citizens. They had a purely domestic and private existence, and public life was reserved for Athenian males. So that's very typical of the ancient world and doesn't change for a long time in history. But this is that's a very sort of a very rigid structure of sort of gender division of labor here, with Athenian men fulfilling the role of public citizens, women reduced to a kind of private and domestic role. Of course, at this time, production is domestic too, so the household is a kind of productive place. It's basically the farm, and you have to grow your living. You have to be able to grow enough to feed everybody who's part of the family in order to live. So there's that division between male and female where only the males are citizens, is a fundamental division. Then we see a division with people who are also called metics, and metics are foreign-born free men and women. So they were born in cities other than Athens, but they are in Athens, presumably to work, and they are called metics in the sense that they are not Athenians, but they are free. They are free to work and to move around. So women and metics are both in the situation of having no power, but having some kind of influence in the city. They're able to influence citizens, but they can't actually speak in the assembly, and they don't have any sort of political rights as such. The lowest level below women and metics, there's a considerable portion of slaves, men and women owned by others, who would have held no power or no influence. And in the ancient world, slaves were, the usual protocol was they were taken in wars. They were sort of part of the spoils of warfare, and so they were sort of the history of previous wars and conquests. And so it's estimated there were about 50,000 or so slaves as well in the ancient city of Athens. Right. So it's interesting to see these kind of layers of citizenship, right? Only men are actually citizens. Women and metics have a reduced status, but below those are slaves, men and women owned by others who don't have any political rights. So it's a kind of layered structure, and very kind of it's kind of minority rule with only male-born citizens at the top. So the body called a bull would sort of select in a draw 500 citizens who would be part of the assembly, and it would also choose the issues to be debated and voted. So all citizens in the assembly could speak, they could vote, and they could be part of, citizens were often part of trials as well. So this was sort of the public function of the Greek state. The assembly openly debated and voted on issues, and it was a form of what today people call direct democracy. And that means that instead of, as we do today, we elect representatives, and representatives sort of represent us in Congress, and they sort of do things on our behalf. In a model of direct democracy like the ancient Athenian structure, citizens vote themselves and they represent themselves, and it's sort of a there's sort of this sliding system where you spend, you're chosen to serve on the assembly, and the next year somebody else is chosen by lot. So it's a kind of a shifting group of citizens, but all citizens serve on the assembly, and they represent themselves as citizens, not a particular group of people. So it's a version of what's called direct democracy. Now, this democracy and the Greek state that, as we saw, was becoming very, very powerful and sort of becoming like an empire, and it's pulling other states into its orbit. This regional power eventually brought it into conflict with another regional power at the time, Sparta. Sparta was a very different type, a more kind of typically military, a city which emphasized military virtues, certainly much more directly than Athens did. And that was illustrated by the fact that from age 7, in a practice military training known as the agoge, meaning leading, developing, resulted in a professional hoplite army. That's these armies here with the swords and the shields, capable of great discipline and relatively sophisticated battle maneuvers, which made them feared throughout Greece and notable for their lack of fortifications. There are interesting resonances of Sparta and some of its history and its kind of traditions, even its lack of fortifications, as we'll see There are kind of references to that in Plato's Republic. And there's something about Sparta, at least, that Plato seems to sympathize with. And we'll see some of those incidences as we sort of work through the Republic. So the Peloponnesian War was eventually won by Sparta. It was a ruinous war for the Athenians, and it resulted in the temporary abolition of the Athenian democracy. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the war, Athens and its allies were organized into what was called the Delian League, and Sparta and its allies were in the Peloponnesian League, and it took up most of the Greek mainland. Corinth fought eventually on Sparta's side, and Athens had a number of notable allies as well, and it involved a lot of different states, and eventually led to a sort of very substantial Spartan victory. So in 411 BCE, the oligarchy of the 400 was imposed by Sparta on Athens after a defeat. This lasted only a few months, wasn't a permanent solution, and the war broke out again shortly afterwards. And then in 404 BCE, after a very decisive naval defeat, the rule of the 30 tyrants, what came to be called the 30 tyrants, was imposed on Athens. It was led by a relative of Plato, Critias. And so there was a lot of rumor, a lot of innuendo about different citizens and the role they played, and the controversies of this era, caused a lot of bad blood between different factions in Athens. A few years after this, and after 404, the democracy was, in fact, it was very shortly after the democracy was once again restored, and the democracy was sort of put in place again. But the sort of memory of these problems lived on in Athens. In 399 BCE, only 5 years after the sort of fall of Athens in 404, Socrates is executed after a trial before the Athenian assembly. And he's executed ostensibly, or officially, if you like, on the grounds of corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of Athens. And it seems to be that there's still a lot of bad blood between Socrates, a lot of rumors about Socrates. And of course, Socrates is this sort of odd figure who teaches philosophy, doesn't take money, isn't interested in sort of money and wealth for his teaching, cares about virtue rather than wealth and fame. So there's a lot of rumors flying about Socrates. Can he be trusted? And in the wake of a sort of a national trauma like the defeat and the installation of the 30 tyrants, after a kind of national trauma like this, it's understandable that there would be some kind of infighting and conflict and antagonism among the Athenians, who were kind of blaming each other for what happened. Okay, so Plato writes the Republic about 15 years after Socrates' death, in about 375 BCE. And when we take a look at the text, we'll see that Plato is dealing with the fundamental problems of democracy that emerged in this period, and he's thinking about what a democracy is and how it works, and also why it failed, and why it failed in particular in this particular context. What was it that sort of that made it fail? What were the kind of structures that didn't work, that weren't viable? And so this is what he gives us in the Republic, a way of a platform and a kind of framework for thinking critically about democracy and its problems that is still just as relevant today as when it was written in 375 BCE. So in the next lecture, we'll take a look and get started on book 1 and start building up this picture of how Plato goes about this task in the Republic.